And the subject of human appetites has engaged thinkers through the ages. You go back in the history of philosophy, philosophers have thought about it, religious gurus have thought about it, and all the writers of Scripture have engaged and addressed the subject of our appetites. And the reason for this is that our appetites are basically fundamental to human experience, a little bit like feeling. We're talking about something very basic to human experience. We are very much an appetite-led and appetite-driven species. And that's the cause of lots of pleasure for us as human persons. It's also the cause, as I'll show you in a moment, of untold misery. But never underestimate how appetite-driven we are. So let's start again by asking what the appetites are. What are they? They have a close connection to the feelings, as we've just described them, but they're also quite distinct. Where feeling is a bodily response to what's happening externally to us, appetites actually originate internally. And they originate internally as hunger, longing, desire. The old guys used to call it passions. So in our bodies are certain hungers. So my definition of appetite would be organic desire. That's what the appetites are. Now again, a little bit of anthropology. To be human is to function in different levels of desire. And the two main categories that I would put forward are these. We have desires that function at the level of the animal. And these are the appetites. Their desires, hungers, directly tied to our bodies, to flesh. So they're attached to the object side of us. But then we also have desires that function at the level of the personal, the spiritual, the supernatural part of us. And these are the much more subjective desires. These are the desires that go beyond the boundaries of nature. So desires tied to our body, very much to our body, but also we have other levels, other kinds of desires that go beyond our bodies. So appetite tied to the body is the most basic desire that all humans have. My definition of a human is that we are desiring beings. That's basically what we are. The essence of us is desire at lots of different levels. The most basic is the bodily part. And this is not to downgrade it. To call it animal is not to say it's bad, it's worthless. This is God's creation. And our appetites provide so many opportunities for pleasure and happiness. And God is for happiness. Some of you have been brought up with teaching where Christianity and the God of your Christianity is a study in gloom. That's not the biblical perspective. In our God, the true and living God, is fullness of pleasure. And part of that pleasure is in the body. Woody Allen, the great 20th century philosopher, summarized it well. He said, man, woman, and woman consist of two parts. His mind and his body. Only the body has more fun. There's a lot of truth to that. So how do the appetites work? Well, appetite as hunger and desire move us, again as a type of emoting, and orient us. And Sigmund Freud, I think very helpfully, showed that appetite function on what's called the pleasure principle. So when you experience a hunger and appetite, what you're experiencing in your body is a deprivation. It's the lack of something. And the appetite, that desire, moves you from deprivation to pleasure. That's how they work. Now let's name just a few of the organic desires that exist in our bodies. The first is food hunger. The language we're using is very connected to food. Appetite, hunger. It's probably the most natural association we make when we think about the appetites. We're now into foodie territory. So you've been deprived of food for a certain amount of time, which for a modern means, if you're in pain, probably 10 minutes. For my kids, it was 5 minutes. And there, in your body, you have some depletion. Interesting, medical science still doesn't know much about the hunger mechanism, but it's some kind of depletion in terms of your body nutrients, and that is experienced as deprivation, and you move to the freezer and serve yourself some ice cream, and you go from deprivation to pleasure. So there's food hunger. Then, of course, we have sexual appetite. Sexual appetite is connected to the libido. This is the sex drive that God gave all human persons. It's related to levels of testosterone in the body. And when this hunger is experienced, we moderns call it frustration. So-and-so is sexually frustrated. That's the deprivation. And you move towards a sexual encounter, whatever that is, and it's taken away. You enter the pleasure state. So food hunger, there's sexual hunger and appetite. I think there's warmth hunger. A few of you here have been to the Manor House in England in the winter, no heating, you're cold all the time, and your body is just begging for warmth, for the fire, to be near the fire. We have, I would say, sleep hunger. When we're exhausted, I only got a few hours sleep last night, so my body is begging for sleep. That's its hunger at this moment in time. Now, when these various appetites bump into reality, we have these hungers internally, they bump into reality, there's two possibilities. The first is easy satisfaction, easy satiation. So the organic desire is experienced within, and it goes on its quest to be satisfied. And in easy satiation, the resistance is negligible, and you're easily satisfied. So you experience your food hunger, you go to the freezer, you scoop the ice cream, you eat it, and or you feel tired after lunch. Some of you are getting tired, I can see it. And you put your head down and you sleep and you wake up. That's pleasure for me. I love the 10-minute nap after. Oh man, that is almost better than any pleasure. You wake up and That's the first possibility, easily satisfied. The second, bump into reality and it's obstacle and resistance. So you experience food hunger, deprivation, you run to the freezer, you open it, My wife, who's very emotional at the moment, has forgotten to buy ice cream. I'm joking. And then you run to Tesco's, or you're to local supermarket, and you go, it's not there either. Now you've got a problem. You cannot easily satisfy this hunger. Now at that point, you either work harder to satisfy it, greater exertion, or, this is radical, you delay gratification. Now, modern psychology, they've seen it, Freud saw it, that a healthy person it is rooted in being able to delay gratification of appetite. It's what good parenting's about. I was not good at that, because we live in an age where your kids want something, you don't deprive them, you just give it to them. We've raised a generation who don't know much about delaying the gratification of their appetite. So that's a brief outline of how appetites work. I just want to add here that our Creator is not opposed to our appetites and the pleasure that they bring. He designed them. If you get pleasure because you're a little bit in a snack mode, you get pleasure from a chocolate bar, that's His pleasure. So the pleasure of appetite is not just a bad thing. Some Christians are so negative here. So that's a bit on what appetites are. I want to now move into the second part, which is the problem of our appetites. Because I just stated there's something good about our appetites. They're not bad. God designed it like this. But we have to face the dark side in terms of our human appetites. And I would say human appetite is the cause of the misery of our world. It's as simple as that. It's the cause of all the misery of our world. It leads to the opposite of pleasure. Living by our appetites is the cause of endless ruin and misery. Think of individual persons in their addictions. They weren't able to delay gratification, and so they became addicted to the pleasure principle, to overcoming deprivation just like that. You could say on the basis of the pleasure principle written into the appetite, we rape, we steal, we commit adultery, and we engage in all kinds of abominable behavior. And that's why every religion, every philosophy, and Christianity has really dealt and focused on the problem of our appetites. Now, let me state the problem like this. It is quite right and appropriate to live in our hungers. God designed us with them. But it's quite wrong and inappropriate to live by our hungers. And that's because our Creator never intended that our existence should be driven and led on the animal level alone. If we live by our appetites, that's the primary desire that leads us through life, we've neglected the deeper desire he's put in every human heart for himself. The great Augustine, you've made us for yourself with a desire, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you. So it's the diminishment of the desire to the lowest possible level, and then we live like the animals. And then all hell breaks loose. The Bible's very strong in this. I could read so many texts. Romans 8, verses 5 to 8. Listen to the language Paul uses here. Describe the problem of appetites. Those who live according to the sinful nature in the NIV is a disastrous translation. It's flesh. Those who live according to the flesh have their mind set on what that nature desires. You're totally obsessed with what your appetites desire. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds, and we're still embodied creatures, on what the Spirit desires. The mind of sinful man is death. But the mind controlled by the Spirit is life and peace. The sinful mind is hostile to God. Those controlled by the flesh cannot please God, because he created us for something so much higher. This conclusion about the destructive nature of the appetites is not just a biblical reflection. Many thinkers have come here. I'm taken with the Russian sociologist Sorokin, who analyzed whole civilizations. He said civilizations function in 3 phases. The last phase, the death rattle phase, he called the sensate phase. When civilizations reach the sensate phase, they're completely driven by appetites. The whole culture becomes appetite-driven, appetite-led, and at that point, it's near the end. Rome in the 1st century entered, in quite a deliberate manner, this death phase, the sensate phase. And here we could break into a lot of cultural analysis, can't we? But on the basis of this analysis, I look at modernity and I think, oh, Lord, have mercy. Because we have really become an appetite-led culture. Paul's reflecting on this phenomena in Ephesians 4. He's living in 1st century Rome. All hell is breaking loose all around him. And Paul really understands the problem of appetites. Look how he puts it in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17. He speaks to the Christians and says, I insist on this, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They're almost not being rational anymore. They are darkened in their understanding. Something's happened here. They're darkened here. Separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. That desire is no longer really functioning. Having lost all sensitivity to higher realms of reality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust, appetite for more. Look at that text. It's actually very profound. Darkened in the understanding, losing sensitivity to higher levels of meaning in human existence, and just carried along by their lusts. He's describing the Roman Empire at that point. Right. We've looked a little bit at what appetites are, how they function. We've looked at the problem. I want to finish briefly now by looking at how we can overcome this problem, because it really is a big problem. For all of us in this room, it's a big problem. How can we overcome it? Well, lots of attention has been given to the overcoming of the appetite problem over thousands of years. And apart from Christianity, which gets it right, because it's God's solution, every other is a false choice. And the problem is being put forward to us in 2 ways. There's 2 movements to overcome or deal with the appetite problem. The first is this: the ascetic path. The ascetic path. What's ascetic path? Well, it's a movement to overcome the appetite through harsh and severe discipline of the body. You got to smash it out. That's the ascetic way. You got to subjugate them through the severe and harsh treatment of the body. Deny the body, deny the body, deny the body. Subject your body to pain and learn how to live in that pain is basically the ascetic path. Amongst the ancient Greeks, we see this in the Stoics and the Gnostics. They saw the problem, and this is the path they advocated. And you see plenty of this within the history of the church. The early Desert Fathers, they said a lot of good things, but they were really committed to the ascetic path. And then you have St. Bruno, who founded the Carthusians in the 11th century, very strong in this ascetic path as a way of dealing with the problem of our appetites. So that's been the one solution, the ascetic path, the harsh treatment. The second is just sheer hedonism. Fight them, blast them, be severe to them, or just go with them. And this was Freud's path at the end of the day. Our appetites are the royal road to pleasure. Don't inhibit them. Your religious parents and your culture has put all kinds of phobias in you about your appetites. You just got to be set free. You got to overcome your family and cultural taboos, especially with respect to your sexual appetite. Just embrace the impulse and go with it. Now, that's a gross simplification of Freud, but there's a lot of that in him. See, that's the hedonistic path. Don't fight them, just go with them. And I think that's where our culture has gone. The psychoanalytic movement, starting with Freud, Reich, Jung, to some degree, it had a tremendous impact. They have formed the modern more than anyone. And this is the path they have advocated. Just on the ascetic path, Colossians 2 might be a passage worth your reflection, because he really goes after the ascetics. He says the harsh treatment of the body is useless. It doesn't work. So, we've looked at what doesn't work. What does work? Well, I want to give 3 biblical principles in terms of how we deal with the problem of our appetites. The first principle I see in the Bible is be aware that our appetites can be trained and propagated. There's the possibility for our appetites to be trained and propagated. C.S. Lewis reflected this in The Abolition of Man in a wonderful way. He said, the head should rule the stomach. Stomach where it hungers. The head can rule it, can train it, can propagate. It can shape what's going on in terms of our hungers. And the explanation for this in modern science, in neuroscience, is the fact that we have plasticity, neuroplasticity. Our bodies are much more plastic than we think they are. They can be trained by habit. Certain kinds of habits change what's going on neurologically in us, and we can behave in a different way. That's exactly what Paul's reflecting in Romans 6. The body has different ways of being oriented. It can be oriented to the desire of the flesh, the way of death, or it can be oriented in the life of the Spirit. But it's your body which gets oriented. So the body can be trained and propagated, and that means we don't have to just blindly follow our appetites. We don't have to live just on the animal level. They can be trained. And that means in the training that we can feel pleasure in the right places and disgust in the right places. When you give the appetites free rein, what almost always happens is that you find pleasure in the wrong places. And in L'Abri, my work at L'Abri, you see the fallout of this, especially in pornography. And when people start, well, all pornography. But there are some who now find pleasure in child pornography, which is illegal, and something which is highly disgusting brings them pleasure. Training, propagating. So we find pleasure in the right places and disgust in the right places. That is essential in terms of dealing with that. So we are not just bodily creatures. We are body, but we're also mind and will. And these are important faculties for, as I say, the propagation. And this is what good parenting should be about for me. It's helping to train and propagate desire for our children. Ripping the wings off butterflies and finding pleasure in that is not a good thing. And actually a lot of real psychopathology starts in that kind of behavior in children. That's not what you find pleasure in, harming animals. So that's the first principle. The second is that we need to simply live into the reality of Christ's death and resurrection. The training and propagation doesn't go far enough. That's what the New Testament stresses. The problem is so great that we need the intervention of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and his death in order to deal with the problem. So Paul says in Galatians 5, verse 24, those who belong to Jesus Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Frequent theme in the New Testament. We have to enter into the crucifixion of Jesus. It's that radical, the problem, in order to begin to live in the freedom of the life of the Spirit. That's how radical the reorientation is needed. And ultimately, the Bible says the reorientation must begin with our hearts. We have to have the elevation of desire to the desire of the heart, and only Jesus' death and resurrection can bring a human person to that orientation. And that's why I love Lewis's quote, and I only gave half of it a minute ago. He said in The Abolition of Man, which is all about being an appetite-driven culture and how it leads in destruction, his famous phrase in The Abolition of Man is that the head must rule the stomach through the chest. Head rules the stomach, but it has to be through the chest, through the heart, through the reorientation of the heart, and only Christ's death can deal with that. Then the final principle I see in the Bible with respect to dealing with the problem is never stop struggling with your appetites. You're going to be in a constant conflict with them, and you have to engage to the ongoing conflict. As significant as the work of Christ is, we're still locked into a struggle with our passions. And where I see this reflected in a pretty painful way is in Romans. You've got the great triumph passages of Romans. You've got Romans 6. Yes, whoa, victory in Jesus. And you've got Romans 8. It's all about victory. We can overcome. And between Romans 6 and Romans 8, what do we have? You guys, 7. Good counting. Oh, Romans 7. What's it about? It's about the struggle. It's the conflict. Bookended, triumph, victory, struggle. We have to keep on struggling. That's what it means to be a Christian, to be engaged in this conflict with our appetites. And the point is not to disregard bodily appetite. It's simply to say, yes, we can live in these in a healthy way, but we have to have an elevation of our desire too. That's one level of desire, but we have other desires. And the work of Christ and engaging in the conflict elevates our desires. So we desire even more than the pleasure of a Mars bar or an afternoon nap.